Roman Empire was antiquity's largest and most powerful state. It reached its zenith under Trajan, Prior 98 to 117, encompassing nearly 2 million square miles and containing some 60 million people. Linking its provinces were more than 250,000 miles of roads, 50,000 of which were paved. Roman engineers founded or improved more than 1,000 cities and towns, transforming the rural European landscape into a marvel of urbanization. In the 3rd century, the Roman army could field 450,000 infantry and cavalry, and 45,000 sailors and marines. By the time Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the Roman army, the oldest continually existing social institution in the Western world, had been on the march for 2 millennia. Rome itself was a magnificent example of cultural, technological, and social superiority in its time. In 356, the city had 28 libraries, 10 basilicas, 11 public baths, 2 amphitheaters, 3 theaters, 2 circuses. The Circus Maximus could seat 150,000 people, the Colosseum 50,000, 19 aqueducts, 11 public squares, 1,352 fountains, and 46,602 apartment buildings. Yet, little more than a century later, barbarian invaders stood astride the empire's corpse, the capital in ruins. The reasons for the empire's demise remain among the great unsettled historical debates. Regardless, it is possible to identify some of the primary forces that rendered the imperial government incapable of dealing with the lethal challenges that beset it. Of all the factors draining the empire of its ability to survive, 4 stand out. The changing nature of the external threat to the empire's western borders, the frequent civil wars among claimants to the imperial throne, the migration and settlement of large, armed, and culturally hostile barbarian populations within the imperial borders, and the gradual erosion and eventual demise of the empire's manpower and the taxpayer base required to sustain, defend, and administer the Roman state. The Romans called the area beyond the western imperial border along the Rhine and Danube rivers the land of the barbarians. Its mostly Germanic-speaking inhabitants were relatively few in number and lived in small villages, their populations limited by their primitive agricultural technology. Employing only the wooden scratch plow, German farmers could not turn the earth sufficiently to maintain its fertility. The soil's ability to sustain adequate agricultural production quickly declined, forcing the population to move every generation or so in search of more fertile land. The small populations and nomadism of the German tribes retarded development of their political structures. Governments were local, comprising mostly clan chiefs, whose ruling power was limited by councils of advisors drawn from among other influential clan members. An individual chieftain did not have the wealth or manpower to form a warrior group loyal to him alone. Instead, clan warriors came together as circumstances required. These groups were usually small and capable only of conducting limited raids. In a few instances, the tribes provided warriors to serve in limited military capacities in the Roman army itself. The Romans used subsidies, trade, military honors, and punitive expedition to ensure the loyalty of the tribes, often playing them off against one another. The German tribes along the western border did not pose a threat to Roman garrisons, and the limited size of the tribal populations meant there was no mass migration. Indeed, the Romans occasionally settled small groups as farmers on the imperial side of the border. But by the 3rd century, circumstances in this region had changed. The presence of Roman garrisons and merchants spurred the economic and socio-political development of the border tribes. The garrisons provided lucrative markets for local agricultural products, metals, slaves, and military recruits. The introduction of Roman agricultural techniques, use of the deep-running iron plow, manure fertilization, and irrigation brought larger farms, abundant food, an explosion in tribal populations, and the establishment of towns, all of which ended the clan's traditional agricultural nomadism and stabilized the populations. These larger tribes required more complex political and organizational structures. Among the more significant developments, was the ability of now wealthy tribal chiefs to support a large warrior class. By the end of the 2nd century, the populations of the tribes along the western imperial borders had grown considerably. When the chiefs of the tribes arranged themselves in confederation under the temporary authority of elected leaders, these confederations could easily field 10,000-man armies. At the same time, the discovery of large metal ore deposits beyond the imperial border created a local armaments industry. Just 2 deposits within the present-day borders of Poland produced 16 million pounds of iron during the Roman period. Before this find, metal weapons were produced singly, were very expensive, and were strictly controlled by Roman authorities. By the 3rd century, local factories along the border were producing thousands of weapons, chiefly swords and spear points, equipping not only the Roman garrisons, but also many tribal warriors. As long as the clans were content to remain under imperial control and limit themselves to periodic raiding, they were no threat to the Romans. But with pressure from other tribes seeking better land or plunder, the large border clans began to present the threat of mass migration across the imperial borders. The tribal chieftains, who were by this time able to support and equip considerable armies, adopted the Roman practice of compulsory, full-time military service. The result was the emergence of well-armed, semi-professional military forces whose leaders had often served in the Roman army. An example of this long-standing practice was Arminius, the German chieftain whose forces massacred 3 Roman legions at the AD 9 Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Thus, even by the end of the 2nd century, the nature and size of the threat facing the Romans across the western imperial border had changed drastically. The Germanic-speaking tribes had become large, politically organized confederations, led by warrior chieftains with competent armies. They remained largely content to raid and plunder Roman settlements on their side of the border. While such raids sometimes brought harsh Roman retaliation, they just as often brought the tribes higher subsidies and greater economic opportunities. But when pushed from behind by other tribes or drawn by the lure of a better economic life, those tribes could pose a significant threat. In the winter of 166, this new reality burst forth when 2 Germanic-speaking tribes, the Langobardi and Ubii, raided the Roman province of Pannonia, present-day Hungary, south of the Danube. A year later, 2 other powerful tribes, the Marcomanni and Victuali, demanded to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. Prompting these demands was pressure from tribes beyond the frontier zone that sought to conquer the area for their own use. Rome was slow to respond. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, or 161-180, was at war with the Parthians and had been diverting troops to that conflict. The Romans were eventually able to contain the pressure, but not before German raiders had besieged Aquileia in Italy itself, and the conflict had dragged on for a decade. The Marcomannic Wars were no mere border raids. The German tribes sacked a number of cities and wrought widespread damage. Amid the warfare, some of the tribes attempted large-scale migration. Between 235 and 275 barbarians launched major raids all along the western Roman frontier, some settling in within the imperial borders. Scholars call this period the 3rd century crisis. The warrior tribes were now a force to be reckoned with and would remain so for the next 2 centuries, until ultimately Roman defenses on the Rhine and Danube frontier collapsed completely. A major factor in Rome's inability to deal with the growing barbarian threat was the recurring state of civil war between emperors and usurpers, the latter usually generals or other officers, who supported some rival claimant to the throne. These clashes brought high casualties, disrupted training and the manpower supply, and drew units away from the Rhine and Danube frontiers. In their respective conflicts with Emperor Theodosius I, Magnus Maximus, R. 383, 388, and Flavius Eugenius, 392, 394, so depleted the Roman border garrisons that the defense of the Rhine was dependent almost entirely on the loyalty of local barbarian client kings. Before the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the Western Roman Empire had experienced few serious civil wars. But between his death in 180 and the deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, in 476, the empire witnessed more than 100 instances of armed violence as would-be usurpers challenged sitting emperors. Some of these conflicts lasted years, exhausting Roman military manpower and leaving the frontiers vulnerable. Ironically, most of the emperors and usurpers then died at the hands of their own subordinates.